Hello and welcome back to the channel. Settle in tonight. Let the lights dim, let your body sink a little deeper into the mattress, and let your mind loosen its grip on the day now behind you. Tonight we travel to a quiet, windswept plain in the south of England, where, for more than 4,000 years, a ring of enormous standing stones has stood in patient silence, watching the sun rise and set across the changing centuries. No one who built it left behind a single word explaining why. And yet, of all the ancient monuments still standing on Earth today, few have drawn more wonder, more theory, and more quiet reverence than this one circle of stone. If you find comfort in these long, slow journeys through forgotten history, please consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so new stories can find you in the quiet hours when you need them. And now, let the modern world fade. Let's travel back across many thousands of years to the plain the ancient world would come to call Stonehenge. To understand Stonehenge, we must first set aside the image most people carry of it. A single, finished circle of grey stone, dramatic against an open sky. That image, true as it is today, represents only the final chapter of a story that unfolded across an extraordinarily long span of time, likely longer than the entire recorded history of ancient Egypt. The landscape itself, long before any stone was raised, was Salisbury Plain, a broad, gently rolling expanse of chalk downland in what is now southern England, cut through by quiet rivers, its soil pale and porous, its grasses kept short by the grazing of wild and later domesticated animals. Long before agriculture reached this part of the world, small bands of hunter-gatherers moved across this open landscape, following herds of deer and wild cattle, camping beside the rivers, leaving behind only the faintest traces of their presence. Scattered flint tools, the occasional hearth, and, remarkably, a cluster of large timber post holes discovered near the site of Stonehenge itself, dating back nearly 10,000 years, to a period long before farming, long before permanent settlement, long before anything resembling the monument we know today. These ancient post holes, some of the oldest confirmed structures anywhere in the British Isles, suggest that this particular stretch of chalk plain held some significance to the people who moved across it, even in this deep, pre-agricultural past. Long, in fact, before the rise of any of the great civilizations we have already explored together on this channel. Whatever drew these earliest visitors to this specific patch of open grassland, whether practical or spiritual or some blend of both now lost entirely to time, it seems this landscape was already, in some quiet way, marked as meaningful long before the first stone was ever moved. It would be many thousands of years later, around 4000 BCE, as farming slowly spread across the British Isles from the European mainland, that the people of this region began to settle more permanently, clearing patches of forest, planting early crops, and raising the first domesticated cattle and sheep upon the open chalk downs. And it was these early farming communities, living in a landscape of scattered timber longhouses and small cleared fields, who would begin, gradually and across many centuries, the long process of transforming this quiet plain into one of the most extraordinary ceremonial landscapes in the ancient world. Picture, if you will, this early landscape. Pale chalk grassland rolling gently beneath a wide open sky, rivers threading quietly through shallow valleys, small clusters of farming settlements scattered across the plain, their inhabitants slowly, patiently, beginning to reshape the very earth beneath their feet into something intended to last far longer than any single human lifetime. Long before the first great stone was raised at Stonehenge, the site's builders created something else entirely. A large, circular earthwork, now known to archaeologists as a henge, consisting of a roughly circular ditch and an accompanying bank of piled chalk and soil, enclosing a wide open area nearly 100 meters across. This first phase of construction, undertaken around 3000 BCE, required an enormous amount of coordinated labor. Workers using tools made from deer antler and the shoulder blades of cattle dug the surrounding ditch by hand, piling the excavated chalk into a raised bank along its inner edge. The scale of this undertaking, achieved without metal tools, without wheeled carts, and quite likely without any domesticated animal larger than cattle to assist in hauling material, speaks to a level of communal organization and shared purpose among the farming communities of this region that we are only now beginning to fully appreciate. Within this newly dug circular enclosure, the earliest builders placed a ring of 56 pits, evenly spaced around the interior edge of the ditch, now known to archaeologists as the Aubrey Holes, named for the 17th century antiquarian John Aubrey, who first identified their traces. What these pits originally held remains one of the enduring mysteries of Stonehenge's long history. Some archaeologists believe they may have held wooden posts, forming an early timber circle preceding the stone monument we know today. Others believe they may have held smaller stones, perhaps early examples of the very bluestones that would later become such a defining feature of the completed monument. And crucially, careful excavation of these pits and the surrounding area has revealed cremated human remains, the burned bone fragments of dozens of individuals buried within and around this earliest phase of the monument, suggesting that from its very beginning, this circular enclosure on the chalk plain served, at least in part, as a place associated with death, memory, and the ancestors. This detail deserves a moment of quiet reflection. Long before the towering stone trilithons that most people picture when they hear the word Stonehenge, this was already, in its earliest form, a place of the dead, a circular precinct on an open plain where the cremated remains of community members were carefully placed, perhaps across many generations, within a monument that would continue to grow and transform around them for the next 1500 years. Sometime around 2900 to 2500 BCE, the monument entered a new and truly extraordinary phase, one that continues to astonish modern researchers and visitors alike: the arrival of the bluestones. These are not the massive grey sarsen stones most associated with Stonehenge's iconic silhouette today, but smaller standing stones, generally under 2 meters in height, composed of a distinctive bluish-grey rock called dolerite, along with several other related stone types. What makes these bluestones so remarkable is not merely their appearance, but their origin. Geological analysis has traced the source of these particular stones to the Preseli Hills, a range of hills in West Wales located an almost unbelievable distance of roughly 180 to 240 kilometers from Salisbury Plain, depending on the specific route taken. Let this detail settle in your mind for a moment because it represents one of the most remarkable feats of prehistoric engineering and communal effort anywhere in the ancient world. Somehow, using nothing but human muscle, wooden sledges, ropes woven from plant fiber, and quite possibly rafts or boats for at least part of the journey along rivers and coastal waters, the builders of Stonehenge transported dozens of multi-ton stones across an enormous distance of hills, valleys, rivers, and quite possibly open sea, from the mountains of Wales to the chalk plains of southern England. Archaeologists and geologists have spent decades attempting to reconstruct exactly how this journey might have been accomplished, and while a definitive route remains debated, most researchers now believe the stones were moved using a combination of overland hauling on wooden sledges or rollers and water transport along rivers, and possibly a stretch of coastal sea route with teams of workers pulling, guiding and steadying each massive stone across every stage of this extraordinary, months-long or even years-long journey. Why would a prehistoric community undertake such an enormous, almost unimaginably difficult task when suitable large stones existed far closer to Salisbury Plain? This question lies at the very heart of Stonehenge's enduring mystery. and we do not have a certain answer. Some researchers have proposed that the Preseli Hills themselves held deep spiritual or ancestral significance to the peoples of this era, perhaps regarded as a sacred source of healing or protective power, a significance so profound that only stone quarried from this specific place would suffice for the monument being built on Salisbury Plain. Other researchers have suggested that the bluestones may have originally formed part of an earlier stone circle already standing in Wales, one that was deliberately dismantled and transported stone by stone to be reconstructed anew on the chalk plain. In effect, an act of moving not just material, but an entire existing sacred monument and the ancestral authority associated with it from one part of the land to another. Whatever the precise motivation, the effort itself tells us something profound about the society that undertook it. This was not the work of a small, isolated community acting alone, but very likely required cooperation, labor, and shared purpose drawn from a wide network of communities spread across a significant portion of ancient Britain, united, for reasons we can only partially reconstruct, around the completion of this singular, monumental task. If the bluestones represent one extraordinary chapter in Stonehenge's long construction history, the arrival of the great sarsen stones beginning around 2500 BCE represents perhaps the most visually dramatic and enduringly iconic phase of all. These sarsens are enormous sandstone blocks, some standing over 7 meters tall and weighing as much as 25 tons each, considerably larger and heavier than the earlier bluestones. Unlike the bluestones' distant Welsh origin, most researchers now believe the sarsens were sourced much closer to Stonehenge itself, quite likely from an area known as West Woods, located roughly 25 kilometers to the north, a considerably shorter journey than the bluestones' extraordinary transport from Wales, though still an enormous undertaking given the sheer size and weight of each individual stone. It is with these great sarsens that the monument took on the form most familiar to us today, a massive outer circle of upright sarsen stones, originally numbering around 30, each one connected to its neighbours by horizontal stone lintels resting atop the uprights, fitted using carefully carved mortise and tenon joints. A woodworking technique, remarkably, translated into stone in which a raised knob carved into the top of each upright stone fit precisely into a corresponding hollow carved into the underside of the horizontal lintel above it, locking the massive stones together in a continuous ring. Within this great outer circle, the builders raised an inner formation of 5 even larger trilithons, pairs of massive upright stones capped by a single, enormous horizontal lintel, arranged in a horseshoe shape open toward the northeast, the tallest of these central trilithons reaching a height of over 7 meters above the ground, with a further 2 meters or more buried beneath the surface to anchor its enormous weight securely in place. The engineering skill required to raise these stones, still fully intact and standing after more than 4,000 years, remains a subject of active study and admiration among modern archaeologists and engineers. Working without metal tools, without the wheel in any significant load-bearing capacity, and without draft animals larger than oxen, the builders of Stonehenge somehow managed to quarry, shape, transport, and precisely erect stones weighing many tons each, fitting them together with a level of structural and even artistic precision that continues to impress those who study ancient engineering today. Some researchers believe timber A-frames, ropes, and earthen ramps were used to lever each upright stone into a prepared pit before hauling it upright using ropes and manpower, then carefully maneuvering the massive lintel stones into place atop the standing uprights using timber scaffolding and a great deal of coordinated human effort. Picture, for a moment, the scene this construction must have presented. Hundreds of workers gathered on the open chalk plain, ropes stretched taut, timber frames creaking under enormous strain, voices calling out in coordinated rhythm as a single sarsen stone, 25 tons of solid rock, was slowly, carefully walked upright into its waiting pit. A moment of communal effort and shared achievement that must have represented, for the community involved, one of the most significant undertakings of their entire lives. Perhaps no single aspect of Stonehenge has captured public imagination more powerfully than its remarkable alignment with the movements of the sun, an alignment so precise and so clearly intentional that it offers us one of our clearest windows into the purpose the monument's builders had in mind. Stand at the center of Stonehenge on the morning of the summer solstice, the longest day of the year in the northern hemisphere, and the rising sun appears to climb directly above a specific outlying stone known today as the heel stone, positioned along the monument's main axis to the northeast, its first light traveling directly down the length of the monument's central avenue and into the heart of the great stone circle itself. This alignment cannot reasonably be attributed to chance. The builders of Stonehenge, across many generations of careful observation, tracking the changing position of sunrise along the horizon throughout the seasons, clearly understood the precise point on the horizon where the sun would rise on this single, significant day each year, and they oriented an enormous, labor-intensive stone monument specifically to capture and frame this moment. Equally significant, though somewhat less famous in popular imagination, is Stonehenge's alignment with the opposite point on the horizon. The setting sun on the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, aligns with the same central axis, viewed from the opposite direction, framed by the great central trilithon at the heart of the monument. Some researchers now believe this winter alignment may, in fact, have held even greater significance to the monument's builders than the more commonly celebrated summer solstice sunrise, given evidence suggesting that significant ceremonial feasting, closely associated with the monument, took place during the winter months, based on analysis of animal bones recovered from a nearby associated settlement. This solar alignment connects Stonehenge to a broader pattern found across many ancient cultures we have explored on this channel and beyond. A deep, careful, patient human attention to the movements of the sun, moon, and stars, tracked across years and generations, and expressed through monumental architecture, oriented with remarkable precision toward the significant turning points of the yearly solar cycle. Whether this attention reflected agricultural necessity, tracking the changing seasons essential to planting and harvest, spiritual or cosmological belief, honoring the sun's death and rebirth at the year's shortest and longest days, or some blend of both practical and sacred concern, the precision of Stonehenge's solar alignment tells us, with real confidence, that this monument was built by a society engaged in sophisticated, patient, long-term astronomical observation, translated into permanent architectural form. Let yourself picture for a moment the scene that must have unfolded here on the morning of the summer solstice across so many ancient generations. A gathered crowd standing in hushed anticipation within and around the great stone circle, the sky slowly lightening toward the northeast, and then, at the precise, long-awaited moment, the first brilliant edge of the rising sun appearing directly above the distant heel stone, its light traveling down the ancient avenue and into the very heart of the monument, greeted, we can only imagine, with some combination of reverence, celebration, and profound collective relief that the great wheel of the year had turned once more. Who precisely were the people responsible for this extraordinary, centuries-long undertaking? This question has occupied historians and archaeologists for centuries, and modern scientific techniques, particularly the analysis of ancient DNA and chemical isotopes preserved within human remains, have begun to offer genuinely new insight into this long-standing mystery. The builders of Stonehenge belong to what archaeologists call the Neolithic farming culture of ancient Britain, descendants, at least in significant part, of farming populations that had migrated into the British Isles from continental Europe many centuries earlier, bringing with them the practices of crop cultivation and animal husbandry that had gradually spread across Europe from origins much further east in the ancient Near East. Isotopic analysis of teeth and bone recovered from burials associated with Stonehenge and the surrounding ceremonial landscape has revealed something remarkable. Some of the individuals buried at and around the monument were not local to the immediate Salisbury Plain region at all, but appear, based on the chemical signatures preserved within their teeth, formed during childhood from the local water and food they consumed, to have grown up in distant regions, including, in some notable cases, areas consistent with the same region of Wales from which the bluestones themselves were quarried. This remarkable finding suggests that the monument's construction and ongoing ceremonial use drew not merely local labour and participation, but genuinely long-distance movement of people, quite possibly including individuals who accompanied the bluestones themselves on their extraordinary journey from the Preseli Hills, whether as labourers, guides, or perhaps even ceremonial or spiritual leaders associated with the stone's original sacred significance. Further research into ancient DNA recovered from Neolithic British burials has also revealed a significant, somewhat unexpected chapter in this story. Sometime after the main phases of Stonehenge's construction, around 2400 BCE, a new population began arriving in Britain from continental Europe, associated with a distinctive style of pottery known as bell beaker ware, along with new burial customs, new metalworking knowledge, introducing the first copper and bronze tools to British soil, and, according to genetic evidence, a substantial degree of population replacement across the British Isles within a relatively short span of generations. This transition, still actively studied and debated among archaeologists, complicates any simple, single narrative of who built Stonehenge, reminding us that the monument's long, multi-phase construction history likely involved several genuinely distinct populations and cultural traditions across its many centuries of active use and continued significance. It is worth sitting with this complexity for a moment, rather than smoothing it into a simpler story than the evidence actually supports. Stonehenge was not raised by a single people in a single generation pursuing a single, unchanging purpose, but was instead shaped, reshaped, and continuously reinterpreted across an extraordinary span of time by several distinct communities, each bringing their own understanding, their own ceremonial practices, and their own reasons for continuing to gather, build, and bury their dead within this same remarkable circle of stone on the open chalk plain. It is a common misconception, understandable given how the monument is typically photographed and presented, that Stonehenge exists in isolation, a single dramatic stone circle standing alone on an otherwise empty plain. In truth, Stonehenge forms only the most famous element of an enormous, deeply interconnected ceremonial landscape, one that unfolds across many square kilometres of Salisbury Plain, and includes dozens of related monuments, avenues and burial sites, many of which remain far less known to the general public, despite their considerable scale and significance. Just over 3 kilometres to the northeast of Stonehenge lies Durrington Walls, the site of what appears to have been a large settlement associated with the monument's construction, along with its own massive henge enclosure, one of the largest such earthworks in all of Britain. Excavations here have revealed evidence of substantial feasting activity, enormous quantities of animal bone, particularly pig bone, showing clear evidence of butchery and consumption on a scale suggesting large seasonal gatherings, quite possibly connected to the winter solstice ceremonies we discussed earlier, drawing participants from across a wide surrounding region for shared feasting and, quite possibly, continued construction work on the nearby stone monument. Connecting Stonehenge to the nearby River Avon is a formal processional avenue, its course marked by parallel banks and ditches extending for nearly 3 kilometers across the landscape, aligned, remarkably, with the very same solstice axis that defines the orientation of the Great Stone Circle itself. This avenue suggests that Stonehenge was approached, at least during significant ceremonial occasions, not casually from any convenient direction, but through a deliberate, extended ceremonial procession moving along a carefully defined path that itself echoed the monument's solar alignment, quite possibly involving movement by water along the river for at least part of this ceremonial journey. Scattered across the wider landscape surrounding Stonehenge are hundreds of burial mounds known as barrows, many clustered in significant groupings along nearby ridgelines, positioned, many researchers believe, quite deliberately to remain visible from the Great Stone Circle itself or to frame significant views across the landscape. These barrows, spanning many centuries of use, contain burials ranging from relatively modest interments to remarkably rich graves containing fine pottery, worked gold and other prestige goods, suggesting a landscape whose significance as a place of memory, ancestry, and status persisted and evolved across an enormous span of time, extending well beyond the main construction phases of Stonehenge itself. Let this wider picture settle in your mind, not a single isolated circle of stone standing alone in an empty field, but the dramatic centerpiece of a vast, carefully organized ceremonial landscape, threaded through with avenues, feasting grounds, and generations of burial mounds, representing what may well have been one of the most significant sacred landscapes in the entirety of ancient Europe. Among the many theories proposed to explain Stonehenge's ultimate purpose, one intriguing line of research deserves particular attention here. The possibility that the monument, or at least certain phases of its long history, may have functioned, at least in part, as a place associated with healing. This theory draws upon several distinct threads of evidence. First, as we discussed earlier, some researchers believe the distant Preseli Hills of Wales, the source of Stonehenge's bluestones, may have held a particular reputation for healing or protective spiritual power, a reputation that could explain the extraordinary effort invested in transporting these specific stones across such a formidable distance when far closer stone sources existed. Second, archaeological analysis of human remains recovered from the burials surrounding Stonehenge has revealed a notably higher than average proportion of individuals showing evidence of significant injury, illness, or physical impairment compared to burial populations from other, less monumentally significant sites of the same broad era in Britain. This pattern has led some researchers to propose that people suffering from illness or injury may have specifically travelled to Stonehenge, from considerable distances in some cases, seeking healing, spiritual comfort, or perhaps simply the community and ritual support of a significant sacred site in a pattern that finds later echoes in the pilgrimage traditions associated with healing shrines across many later cultures and religious traditions. It is important in considering this theory alongside the many others proposed over the years to hold it with appropriate humility and openness. Stonehenge's true, complete purpose, or more likely, purposes, evolving as they very likely did across its extraordinarily long history of use and reinterpretation, cannot be reduced with full certainty to any single explanation, not healing alone, not solar observation alone, not ancestor veneration alone, not communal feasting and gathering alone. The most honest, and in many ways the most quietly moving understanding available to us today, is that Stonehenge likely served across its long centuries of active significance as a place holding multiple interwoven layers of meaning simultaneously, a monument to the dead, a marker of the sun's great yearly cycle, a destination for healing and pilgrimage, a site of communal feasting and celebration, and a powerful symbol of shared identity and cooperative achievement among the scattered farming communities of ancient Britain. Once the great sarsen circle and central trilithons had been raised, sometime after 2500 BCE, Stonehenge entered into many further centuries of continued use, adjustment, and ceremonial significance, a period considerably longer than the time that has passed since the fall of the Roman Empire to the present day. Throughout this extended period, evidence suggests the monument continued to be modified in various ways. Some of the bluestones appear to have been rearranged into new configurations at different points across this long span of use, and further burials, along with evidence of continued ritual activity, including the deliberate placement of offerings and the careful maintenance of the site's ditches and earthworks, continued across many further centuries. We can only imagine, with appropriate humility about the limits of our certain knowledge, the countless generations of ceremony that must have unfolded within and around this great stone circle across these many centuries, seasonal gatherings drawing participants from across the surrounding region, the cremated remains of respected community members carefully interred within the sacred precinct established so many generations before their birth, the careful, patient tracking of the solstice sunrise and sunset, continuing year after year, connecting each new generation of participants to the very same solar rhythm their distant ancestors had first sought to capture in stone. Picture, if you will, the scene across these long centuries. A community gathering on the open chalk plain as the light of dawn begins to gather along the northeastern horizon, elders perhaps recounting stories of the great stone's distant origin passed down across so many generations that the true details of their extraordinary journey from the Welsh mountains had likely blurred, by this point, into something closer to sacred legend than precise historical memory. And yet the stones themselves remained, standing in their careful circle, a physical, permanent link to that distant, half-remembered past, continuing to frame the rising and setting sun exactly as their ancient builders had so carefully intended. By around 1600 BCE and continuing across the subsequent centuries, evidence suggests that active ceremonial use of Stonehenge itself gradually began to decline, even as the surrounding landscape continued to hold significance, reflected in the continued construction and use of burial mounds across the wider area for some further time. The precise reasons behind this gradual decline in the monument's central ceremonial role remain, like so much of Stonehenge's story, only partially understood. Some researchers point to broader cultural and technological shifts occurring across Britain during this era, particularly the increasing spread of bronze metalworking technology and its associated cultural changes which may have gradually reshaped the ceremonial priorities and practices of the wider British population, shifting focus away from the older monumental stone circle tradition toward new forms of ritual and status expression more closely tied to metal weapons, tools, and ornaments. By the time the Roman Empire extended its reach into Britain, beginning around 43 CE, Stonehenge had already stood for well over 2,000 years, its original builders and their descendants' long since passed from living memory. Its original purpose likely already the subject of speculation, legend, and reinterpretation among the peoples who continued to live across the surrounding landscape. Roman-era artifacts found at the site suggest some continued visitation and interest during this later period, though the monument's role by this point had almost certainly shifted dramatically from its original Neolithic and early Bronze Age significance, transformed instead into something closer to an ancient curiosity, already deeply mysterious even to the classical world that would later leave behind the first written records mentioning the monument's existence. Across the many further centuries that followed, through the Roman period, the subsequent Anglo-Saxon era, and into the medieval period beyond, Stonehenge continued to stand upon its open plain, gradually accumulating layers of legend and folklore far removed from its true, original purpose. Medieval writers speculated that the monument had been raised by giants, or transported magically through the powers of the wizard Merlin from a distant land. Stories reflecting not any genuine surviving knowledge of the monument's true Neolithic origins, but rather the very human tendency to weave new explanatory myth around ancient, silent, and deeply impressive structures whose true history has long since faded from memory. It was not until the modern era, beginning in earnest during the 17th century, that serious, systematic study of Stonehenge began to slowly strip away centuries of accumulated legend and approach the monument with something closer to genuine historical and archaeological curiosity. Early antiquarians such as John Aubrey, whose careful observations first identified the ring of pits later named in his honor, and later William Stukely, whose detailed surveys and drawings in the early 18th century preserved valuable records of the monument's condition at that time, began the long, patient process of documenting Stonehenge's physical features with genuine scholarly care, moving beyond the folklore of giants and wizards toward more grounded observational study, even as the true age and full significance of the monument remained, for these early researchers, still largely mysterious. The truly transformative breakthroughs in understanding Stonehenge's real chronology, however, would not arrive until the 20th century, particularly following the development of radiocarbon dating technology in the mid-1900s, which finally allowed researchers to establish, with genuine scientific confidence, the true, extraordinary age of the monument's various construction phases, confirming that Stonehenge's origins reached back nearly 5,000 years, considerably earlier than many earlier theories, some of which had mistakenly attributed the monument's construction to far later cultures, such as the Romans, or even, in some particularly persistent but entirely mistaken folk traditions, to the ancient Druids of Iron Age Britain, whose actual historical period began many centuries after Stonehenge's main construction phases had already concluded. Ongoing archaeological research across the following decades, including major excavation projects extending into the 21st century, has continued to refine and deepen our understanding of the monument, revealing the extraordinary wider ceremonial landscape we explored earlier, tracing the precise geological origins of both the bluestones and sarsens with remarkable geological precision, and applying increasingly sophisticated scientific techniques, including the ancient DNA analysis we discussed in Chapter 6, to gradually reconstruct a far richer, more nuanced understanding of the people who built, used, and continually reinterpreted this remarkable monument across its extraordinarily long history. Today, Stonehenge remains one of the most visited and most carefully studied ancient monuments anywhere in the world, protected as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, drawing over 1 million visitors each year to stand at a respectful distance from the ancient stones themselves, and experience something of the quiet, enduring power this circle has held across so many thousands of years. Twice each year, on the mornings of the summer and winter solstices, modern crowds still gather at Stonehenge in a tradition that, while shaped by many centuries of changing cultural context, nonetheless echoes something genuinely ancient. A continued human desire to witness, together, in community, the sun's significant turning points marked so precisely by this ancient circle of stone. Modern druids, pagans, archaeologists, and simply curious visitors from around the world gather in the pre-dawn darkness, watching, as so many thousands of generations before them have watched, for the first light of the solstice sun to appear along the same horizon line the monument's original builders so carefully identified nearly 5,000 years ago. Standing before the great sarsen circle today, a visitor can still trace, with genuine wonder, the careful mortise and tenon joints locking each massive lintel stone to its supporting uprights, still admire the precise, patient engineering that allowed Neolithic farmers working without metal tools or the wheel to raise stones weighing many tons into a configuration that has, remarkably, survived largely intact across more than 4,000 years of British weather, war, and changing culture. A visitor can walk, at least in imagination, along the ancient ceremonial avenue toward the River Avon, can look out across the wider landscape toward Durrington Walls and the many surrounding burial mounds, and can begin to appreciate, even if only partially, the true scale and complexity of the sacred landscape that Stonehenge represents. And a visitor can simply stand quietly in the presence of these ancient stones and allow themselves to feel something of what so many generations of visitors, pilgrims, worshippers, and mourners must have felt across the many thousands of years since the first stone was ever raised upon this quiet chalk plain. A sense of genuine awe at what patient, coordinated human effort, sustained across many generations and driven by purposes we can only partially reconstruct, proved capable of achieving, long before writing, long before metal tools, long before almost everything we typically associate with the beginnings of complex human civilization. Perhaps the single most remarkable aspect of Stonehenge's long story, when we step back and consider it as a whole, is precisely the aspect that makes it, in some ways, so endlessly fascinating: its enduring, unbroken silence regarding its own true purpose. Unlike the many civilizations we have explored together on this channel, Axum with its royal inscriptions proclaiming conquest and faith, Silla with its careful court chronicles recording the reigns of kings and queens, even Karal with its knotted quipu chords offering hints of a recording system whose function we can partially reconstruct. Stonehenge's builders left behind no writing whatsoever, no inscriptions, no chronicles, nothing beyond the stones themselves and the patient, careful, physical evidence buried within the surrounding earth. This silence is, in its own way, a kind of profound honesty about the genuine limits of historical knowledge. We can trace, with real scientific confidence, the origin of the bluestones to the distant Preseli Hills of Wales. We can measure, with genuine precision, the monument's remarkable alignment with the solstice sunrise and sunset. We can identify, through careful isotopic and genetic analysis, something of the diverse origins and movements of the people buried within and around the monument across its many centuries of use. And yet, for all of this genuine scientific insight, the deepest question: what did this place truly mean in the hearts and minds of the people who devoted such extraordinary, sustained effort to its construction and continued use across so many centuries, remains, and will very likely always remain, only partially answerable, a mystery held quietly within stones that have chosen, across 4,500 years, never to fully explain themselves. There is something worth sitting with in this particular kind of not knowing, rather than rushing past it toward some falsely tidy conclusion. Stonehenge asks us, in its patient silence, to hold genuine uncertainty alongside genuine wonder, to accept that some of humanity's most extraordinary ancient achievements may never yield up their complete meaning to us, and that this incompleteness does not diminish the monument's power, but perhaps in its own quiet way deepens it. As we come to the end of this long, slow journey, let your mind rest for a moment on the image of that open chalk plain in southern England, its pale grasses rippling gently beneath a wide, changing sky. Let yourself picture the earliest builders working with tools of deer antler and bone, digging the first great circular ditch by hand, piling chalk into a low protective bank, beginning, without knowing it, a project that would continue, in one form or another, for the next 1,500 years. Let yourself picture the extraordinary journey of the bluestones. Teams of workers hauling multi-ton stones across hills, rivers, and quite possibly open sea, carrying with them not merely raw material, but perhaps the accumulated spiritual significance of a distant, sacred Welsh landscape, determined to bring that significance all the way to this quiet plain in the south. Let yourself picture the raising of the great sarsens, ropes stretched taut, timber frames groaning under enormous strain, an entire community gathered in coordinated, patient effort to lift a single 25-ton stone upright into its waiting pit, achieving, through nothing but human strength and careful engineering, a feat that continues to impress engineers working with modern technology today. Let yourself picture the countless solstice mornings that followed, across so many generations, gathered crowds standing in hushed anticipation as the first light of the rising sun climbed slowly above the distant Heelstone, traveling down the ancient avenue and into the very heart of the great stone circle, the whole community bound together year after year, century after century, by this same shared, patient watching. And let yourself picture, finally, the quiet stones as they stand today, still holding their ancient positions upon the open plain, still catching the light of each solstice sunrise exactly as they were built to do nearly 5,000 years after the first ditch was dug into this quiet chalk earth. A silent, enduring monument to a purpose we can only partially know, and to a patience and a shared human effort that we can still, even now, stand quietly before and genuinely admire. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, drifting through the long, patient history of Stonehenge. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing to the channel so that more stories like this one can find their way to you in the quiet hours when you need them most. Share this with anyone who might enjoy a slow, calm journey into forgotten history. Rest now. Let the great stones settle back into the quiet of the open plain. Let the solstice light fade gently from memory. Let the ancient circle drift softly beyond the edge of sleep. Sleep well, and good night.